I still remember the taste of my mother's bread, sweet with honey and the rich grains harvested from Vidia Prime's southern fields. It was baked in the quiet pre-dawn hours, long before the work bells would echo across our settlement. This familiar memory surfaces even now, as I stand within the cold, echoing armoring chambers of the fortress monastery, watching the deep crimson paint dry on my ceramite plates. 437 years have passed since that last taste of bread. 437 years since I was called anything other than Brother Cassius of the Blood Ravens' Third Company. The children of the Imperium are told we are angels, living gods, encased in blessed armor, descended from the Emperor's own genetic legacy to shield humanity from the abyssal darkness beyond the stars. In their ornate picture books and the grand murals adorning their cathedrals, we are depicted as radiant, silver-clad saints, our bolters singing hymns of righteous fury as we cleave through both heretic and alien. The propaganda feeds endlessly trumpet our glory, our honor, our eternal vigilance. But they never speak of the true cost. They never tell you that to ascend to the status of an angel, you must first meticulously dismantle and forget every trace of your former humanity. I was barely 11 when the chapter chaplain's vessel touched down on our world. 11 years old, absorbed in mock war games amidst the vast agricultural fields with my younger brother Matthias, while our parents toiled on the endless harvest lines. The sky that day was the color of burnished copper, heavy with the promise of rain that, as was often the case, would never materialize. A punishing 6-month drought had gripped the planet, yet the planetary governor's tithes remained cruelly unchanged. Whispers began to circulate among the populace, words that would have earned a swift flogging in the capital's plazas. But in the distant outer settlements, sheer desperation often birthed loose tongues. The thunder began just after midday prayers. It wasn't the familiar rumble of an approaching storm, but something deeper, more resonant, undeniably mechanical. Matthias and I scrambled up the tallest grain tower in our sector, our small hands gripping the rusted ladder rungs, driven by an urgent curiosity to get a better view. What we witnessed there changed everything. Drop pods, a dozen of them, plummeting through the atmosphere like fiery falling stars, their retro thrusters carving incandescent scars across the copper sky. They struck the earth in perfect, terrifying formation, each impact crater precisely calculated to encircle our settlement without so much as marring the critical harvest infrastructure. When the dust settled and their ramps hissed open, they emerged. Space Marines of the Blood Ravens. Chapter. Even at 11, even as a simple agri-world child who had never encountered anything more dangerous than a feral pack of groks, I intrinsically understood what they were. Every citizen of the Imperium recognizes the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's chosen, the Angels of Death. But seeing them in person, watching their immense forms stride through our settlement, casting impossibly long shadows across the dry dust, ignited a feeling within me I had never anticipated. Terror. They were too gargantuan, too flawless, too utterly divorced from anything recognizably human. Their armor seemed to hum with embedded hymns as they moved, each heavy footstep sending faint tremors through the ground beneath us. When they spoke, their voices carried the amplified mechanical resonance of Vox units, transforming even the simplest words into profound pronouncements from on high. They had come for recruitment, they declared. The chapter required new aspirants, and Vidia Prime had been granted the unparalleled honor of contributing to the Emperor's armies. My mother wept when they called my name. Not tears of joyous pride, as the settlement administrator loudly assured everyone, but something far deeper, a profound lament of loss and endings rather than glory and honor. She knew, with an instinct no one else possessed, what the rest of us were only just beginning to grasp. Her son would depart that day, but he would never truly return. The being that came back, if anything came back at all, would bear his face, but none of his heart. The selection process was brutally swift and entirely merciless. It began with rigorous physical examinations, followed by precise genetic screening, and concluded with cold, dispassionate psychological evaluations. Of the 300 children in our settlement, ranging from 10 to 12 years of age, a mere 7 passed these initial stringent requirements. I was among them. Matthias was not. I can still vividly recall the complex look in his eyes as the chaplain's servo-skull completed its biological scan of him and then moved on silently, without recording his data. A warring blend of relief and disappointment flickered across his young face, and even amidst my own nascent pride, I found myself envying him. There were no farewells permitted, no final meals shared with our families, no last nights spent in the comfort of familiar beds. The chaplain, his voice grave, explained that any lingering attachment to our former lives would only serve to weaken us during the arduous trials that lay ahead. We were no longer merely the children of Vidia Prime. We were aspirants of the Blood Ravens, servants of the Emperor, and our old identities had become nothing more than irrelevant impediments to our sacred transformation. The journey to the chapter's fortress monastery spanned 3 grueling months, aboard a colossal battle barge named the Litany of Fury. 3 months confined to the ship's lower decks, crammed into austere dormitories with aspirants from dozens of other worlds. Boys who had been simple farmers like me, but also hardened gang fighters from sprawling hive cities, fierce tribal warriors from savage death worlds, and even noble-born youths from sophisticated civilized planets. The chapter cast its net wide, seeking not merely brute physical strength, but precise genetic compatibility with the sacred gene seed of their Primarch. During that unforgiving voyage, we learned our very first lesson about the true meaning of service to the Astartes. We learned about expendability. Of the 47 aspirants who had boarded the ship, only 32 survived the journey. Some perished from failed medical procedures as the ship's apothecaries commenced the preliminary organ implantation process. Others succumbed to the relentless combat training, their young bones fracturing under the immense weight of conditioning regimens designed to prepare human children for superhuman trials. A few simply broke mentally, their minds unable to comprehend the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what they were becoming. These, we were taught, were the fortunate ones. They died quickly. The fortress monastery of the Blood Ravens stands grimly on a moon named Aurelia's Grief, eternally orbiting a dead star in a system long since erased from imperial cartographers' records. It is a structure of impossible cyclopean scale, painstakingly carved from the moon's living rock and reinforced with adamantium bulkheads capable of withstanding even orbital bombardment. Gothic spires, like grasping, petrified fingers, reach toward the void, each one housing specialized training chambers, austere meditation cells, and the countless, irreplaceable artifacts the chapter has meticulously recovered from across the vast expanse of the galaxy. Walking through its labyrinthine corridors for the first time, I felt the crushing weight of 10 millennia of history pressing down on me. 10,000 years of brutal warfare had echoed through these very halls. Thousands of aspirants had trod the same paths I walked, and most of them had perished in the attempt. The very walls seemed to whisper tales of failure and sacrifice, of boys who had once dreamed of becoming angels, only to find an anonymous death awaiting them in the encroaching darkness. The true trials began immediately upon our arrival. They called it the proving, though I would later understand it was merely the first in an endless series of tests, meticulously designed to utterly break us down and then rebuild us in strict accordance with the chapter's unyielding needs. For 6 months, we were subjected to physical conditioning that would have undoubtedly killed fully grown men from our homeworlds. We ran grueling obstacle courses clad in powered armor far too heavy for our still developing frames. We engaged in vicious, hand-to-hand combat exercises against servitors programmed not just to defeat us, but to maim. We studied the Codex Astartes relentlessly until we could recite its tactical doctrines flawlessly in our sleep. And then, we were tested on that knowledge, while simultaneously enduring levels of pain that would have driven any adult to madness. Of the 32 aspirants who had arrived on Aurelia's grief, only 18 survived the first month. The others were interred in unmarked graves within the monastery's deepest chambers, their names meticulously recorded in the chapter's archives, but never again spoken aloud. We were expressly forbidden to mourn them. Grief, we were told, was a weakness that would critically compromise our effectiveness as warriors. Those who exhibited any signs of emotional attachment to their fallen brothers were subjected to additional, harsher conditioning, a process that often involved potent psychoactive drugs, hypno-indoctrination, and in some extreme cases, even surgical modification of brain chemistry itself. I learned, by necessity, to stop caring about the names of the boys who simply vanished during training. It began as a survival mechanism, but it quickly became something far more fundamental, a necessary clinical amputation of human empathy that would serve me with chilling efficacy in the centuries to come. The first organ implantation came at the conclusion of that initial, brutal training period. They called it the secondary heart, a redundant cardiovascular system engineered to allow us to survive wounds that would instantly kill any normal man. The intricate surgery was performed in the monastery's deepest chambers, within operating theaters that dated back to the very dawn of the Great Crusade. Ancient, humming machinery pulsed with barely contained power as the apothecaries meticulously prepared their instruments, their servo arms moving with inhuman precision as they sliced open my chest and began the terrifying process of reshaping my physiology. I remained conscious throughout the entire procedure. The apothecaries calmly explained that pain was not merely a side effect, but an intrinsic part of the process itself, that learning to function effectively while experiencing agonizing torment was a crucial skill for any true space marine. And they were right. Over the following years, I would be shot, stabbed, burned, frozen, poisoned, and crushed more times than I could possibly count. The acquired ability to compartmentalize pain, to push it aside and continue fighting would save my life countless times. But it would also extract an immeasurable cost. Something essential, something I didn't even recognize. I was losing until it was irrevocably gone. The months that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of additional surgeries and escalating trials. The osmodula which strengthened our bones until they could turn aside even the biting blades of a chainsword. The Biscopia, which enhanced our muscle density and reaction time far beyond human limits. The Haemostamin, which vastly improved our blood's oxygen-carrying capacity, allowing us to survive in environments that would instantly asphyxiate normal humans. Each successive implant drew us closer to the Astartes ideal, but simultaneously pulled us further, irrevocably, from the children we had once been. I stopped dreaming about my mother's bread during this period. I stopped dreaming about Matthias, about the warm copper sky of Vidia Prime, about anything that connected me to my previous existence. The chapter's conditioning programs were masterfully designed to sever these ties, to forge warriors who would serve the Emperor without the debilitating distraction of personal loyalties or emotional attachments. They were remarkably effective. By the time I received my 13th organ implant, the catalepsian node, which allowed me to remain fully alert even during periods of rest, I had utterly forgotten what it felt like to miss home. I had forgotten that I had ever had a home at all. The black carapace was the final implantation, the neural interface that would allow my very being to merge with the machine spirits of my power armor and weapons. It was also, by far, the most perilous. Of the 11 aspirants who had managed to survive to that point, 4 perished during the procedure. Their young bodies violently rejected the synthetic material, and they expired in agonizing convulsions as their immune systems waged a losing war against the foreign tissue. We watched them die in the recovery chambers, their forms twitching and screaming as the carapace toxins spread inexorably through their bloodstreams. I felt nothing as they screamed. Nothing at all. This chilling absence of feeling was the truest, most definitive sign that my transformation was complete. I had become something that could witness children die without experiencing a flicker of grief or compassion. Something that could observe profound suffering and remain coldly focused solely on tactical objectives. I had become precisely what the Imperium needed me to be. I had become a weapon. The solemn ceremony that marked my full induction into the Blood Ravens took place in the chapter's Reclusium, a vast cathedral-like chamber carved from obsidian black stone and illuminated by the flickering glow of thousands of devotional candles. Chaplain Maricus spoke the ancient words of binding, the sacred oath that would irrevocably tie my soul to the chapter's service for whatever remained of my existence. I knelt before the Emperor's altar and swore to defend humanity against its myriad enemies, to serve the Golden Throne without question, and to die before allowing dishonor to stain the chapter's venerable reputation. When I rose from that altar, I was no longer the farm boy from Vidia Prime. I was Brother Cassius, battle brother of the Blood Ravens 3rd Company, servant of the Emperor of Mankind. The name I had been given at birth was formally recorded in the chapter archives, but it was never spoken again. That person had died, utterly consumed during the transformation process. And what emerged was something new, something purposeful, something formidable, yet utterly empty of everything that had once made him human. My first combat deployment came 3 months later, aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Fury. Our destination was a Forge world designated Metallica 7, where intelligence reports indicated a possible chaos incursion gravely threatening the planet's vital industrial output. The journey itself consumed 6 weeks, navigating the treacherous currents of the warp. 6 weeks during which I experienced my first true, unfiltered taste of what existence as a space marine would entail. Training. Constant. Relentless. Endless training. We practiced boarding actions in the ship's mock-up corridors, engaging in brutal room-to-room battles against servitors programmed with the precise tactical patterns of known enemy forces. We meticulously studied enemy psychological profiles until we could predict heretic behavior with almost mathematical precision. We maintained our equipment with a devotional, almost religious care, understanding that every bolt, every power cell, every component was a sacred tool in the Emperor's service. We prayed, we meditated, we prepared our minds for the absolute certainty of violence that awaited us on every world we would ever visit. But mostly, we learned to function as an indivisible unit. Individual identity, our sergeants drilled into us, was a luxury the Adeptus Astartes could simply not afford. We were not 11 separate warriors fighting for personal glory. We were a single weapon with 11 integrated components, each one ultimately expendable if its sacrifice would serve the greater tactical objective. This crucial lesson was relentlessly reinforced through combat simulations where squad members were randomly designated as casualties, requiring the survivors to adapt their tactics on the fly while simultaneously exhibiting no emotional response whatsoever to their fallen brother's simulated demise. I learned to watch my squad mates die and immediately reassess my firing angles to maximize the effectiveness of our remaining firepower. I learned to step over their bodies without breaking stride if the mission demanded forward momentum. I learned to strip ammunition and equipment from their corpses if supplies dwindled, treating their remains as mere battlefield resources rather than the shells of men I had trained beside for months. These were undeniably necessary skills in the arduous campaigns that followed. They would save my life and the lives of countless Imperial citizens. But they came at a cost the recruitment posters conveniently never mentioned. A price paid in the gradual, insidious erosion of everything that had once made me capable of human connection. Metallica 7 was a world perpetually shrouded in industrial twilight. Its skies choked with the acrid exhaust of 10,000 manufactorums, its surface perpetually hidden beneath layers of reeking ash and steel. The Chaos incursion had originated in the planetary capital's lowest industrial sectors, where reports suggested factory workers had been engaging in forbidden rituals involving the very machine spirits of their equipment. Local Guard and Arbeits units had been dispatched to investigate, but their Vox communications had ceased abruptly 3 days before our arrival. Our mission was straightforward. Investigate the source of the disturbance, eliminate any heretical influences we uncovered, and restore the planet's manufacturing capacity to acceptable levels. The lives of individual workers were, chillingly, considered acceptable losses if their sacrifice preserved the Forge world's strategic value to the wider Imperial war effort. We made planetfall during the world's artificial night cycle, a period when the manufactorums traditionally reduced their output to conserve reactor fuel. Our drop pods struck the industrial sector's primary thoroughfare with surgical precision, each impact calculated to minimize damage to surrounding infrastructure, while providing optimal tactical positioning for urban combat operations. When the ramps hissed open and we emerged into the sulfur-tainted air, I got my first visceral taste of what true warfare would be like. The silence was wrong, profoundly, disturbingly wrong. Metallica 7 should have been thundering with the cacophony of industrial production, but the streets lay empty and eerily quiet, save for the distant, almost imperceptible hum of automated systems. Warning runes flickered intermittently from voxcasters mounted on corridor walls, broadcasting urgent messages in High Gothic that spoke of strict quarantine protocols and mandatory curfews. The air itself tasted of metallic dust and corruption, carrying scents that my enhanced olfactory systems identified as human decomposition intermingled with something else, something profoundly alien, something that didn't belong in any Imperial database. Brother Sergeant Thalen raised his armored fist, signaling a halt as we cautiously approached the first massive manufactorum complex. Through the facility's reinforced windows, we could discern movement in the shadows, humanoid shapes, but moving in patterns that suggested chilling coordination rather than panicked flight. They were waiting for us. They had been waiting for some time. The first shots erupted from elevated positions, crude autogun rounds that sparked harmlessly off our power armor, yet effectively revealed the positions of our attackers. They were indeed factory workers, but their flesh had been grotesquely altered by insidious influences that corrupted both mind and body. Vile mechanical augmentations sprouted from their limbs in configurations that violated every principle of orthodox Imperial technology, while their faces displayed signs of mutation that screamed of prolonged exposure to warp energies. We responded with disciplined, overwhelming bolter fire, our weapons singing their hymns of purification as mass reactive shells found their targets with explosive force. The corrupted workers died quickly, their modified bodies offering virtually no protection against weapons designed to obliterate armored enemies. But for every cultist that fell, two more seemed to emerge from the deepening shadows. They were organized. They had clearly been expecting us. They had prepared. The brutal battle raged for 4 grueling hours, taking us through 17 different industrial complexes before we finally reached the very source of the corruption. In the deepest forgotten levels of the primary manufactorum, we discovered what remained of the word-bearer infiltration team that had ignited the uprising. They had established a grotesque shrine to the Dark Mechanicum in the facility's main reactor chamber, brazenly using the Forge World's own vast power systems to amplify their blasphemous rituals. The shrine itself was a writhing fusion of abhorrent technology and corrupted flesh, a sight so vile it physically hurt to gaze upon directly, a pulsating mass of human tissue and twisted machinery that radiated malevolent energy. Standing before this obscenity was something that had once been human, but now served as a living vessel for the terrifying powers that dwelt within the warp. It spoke to us in voices that belonged to the dead workers, promising us forbidden knowledge that would transcend the limited understanding of the Omnissiah. It offered us power far beyond the crude augmentations of our gene seed, evolution beyond the pathetic restrictions of our flesh. It showed us seductive visions of what we could become if we simply abandoned our loyalty to the Corpse Emperor and embraced the liberating truth of chaos. I felt nothing as I raised my bolter and put 6 mass reactive rounds directly through its center mass. Nothing, that is, except a cool professional satisfaction at the successful completion of our mission parameters. The corrupted being collapsed into its constituent flesh and metal components, its dying shriek echoing grotesquely through the reactor chamber as the shrine's malevolent power source flickered and finally died. The pervasive corruption that had spread through Metallica 7's industrial sector would now wither without its focal point, and the planet's vital manufacturing capacity could be restored within standard Imperial parameters. We had won our first victory. We had served the Emperor. We had protected the Imperium from the insidious influence of chaos. Everything had proceeded exactly as our rigorous training had prepared us to expect. But as we prepared for extraction from the facility, Brother Varian made a quiet observation that would, decades later, still subtly haunt me. The corrupted workers, he noted, had fought with a desperate, unwavering courage, even when faced with impossible odds. They had died defending something they deeply believed in, something that had given their miserable lives meaning beyond mere survival. Their corruption had been absolute, their damnation certain, but they had died with a profound sense of purpose. We, by stark contrast, had killed them with chilling efficiency and utterly without emotion. We had performed our function perfectly, but we had felt nothing while doing so. No righteous anger at their heresy, no triumphant satisfaction at their defeat, no flicker of grief for the lives they had so tragically wasted in service to dark powers. We had simply eliminated them because our orders required it. In the same dispassionate way we might repair a damaged piece of equipment or clean the barrel of a bolter. This realization, perhaps, should have troubled me, but it didn't. I had been conditioned to perceive this emotional emptiness as strength, rather than an irretrievable loss. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments between missions, a faint, almost imperceptible curiosity would stir within me. I would find myself wondering what it might feel like to care about something enough to willingly die for it, to believe in something so profoundly that death seemed preferable to the abandonment of that conviction. I would never know. The relentless conditioning that had forged me into an effective warrior had also, with surgical precision, rendered me utterly incapable of that kind of faith. I served the Emperor because I had been programmed to serve, not because I had chosen to believe. I fought chaos because my orders unequivocally required it, not because I truly understood why their influence was worth opposing. I protected humanity not from love, but from an unyielding sense of duty. And duty, stripped of love, is merely blind obedience to authority. The campaigns that followed Metallicus 7 blurred into a continuous, unforgiving cycle of violence and victory. Orc incursions on agri-worlds, where we slaughtered greenskins by the thousands, while the local populations cheered our arrival. Tau expeditions on industrial planets, where we engaged in brutal running battles against precise pulse rifle formations and battle suits that could match our power armor pound for pound. Tyrannid swarms on death worlds, where we held defensive positions until ammunition ran critically low, then continued fighting with combat knives and bare hands until reinforcements finally arrived or we perished in the attempt. Each campaign taught me new, ruthless lessons about warfare, about tactics, about the countless, brutal ways that the enemies of the Imperium could be killed or neutralized. I learned to read battlefield conditions at a glance, to instantly adapt our squad's firing patterns to maximize casualties while meticulously minimizing ammunition expenditure. I learned to identify weak points in enemy formations, and then exploit them with devastating surgical precision. I was trained to wage war across every conceivable battlescape, from the absolute void of space to the crushing, lightless depths of ocean trenches. I faced every imaginable threat, from mindless, ravening beasts to cunning, strategic masterminds who could anticipate our every move encounter with equal, formidable skill. Yet for all this training, I never learned to truly care about the countless individuals we were ostensibly sworn to protect. The billions of Imperial citizens whose lives and deaths hinged upon the outcomes of our incessant battles. remained nothing more than abstract concepts, statistical figures, not people worthy of personal concern. They were merely strategic assets to be preserved when expedient and acceptable losses when necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. This cultivated emotional detachment proved highly beneficial, serving me particularly well when our forces were deployed to quash rebellions erupting across so-called civilized worlds. These were planets where imperial citizens had been swayed by charismatic leaders, beguiled by promises of better lives should they cast off the burdensome yoke of imperial taxation and suffocating regulation. These were worlds where families actively resisted our arrival, genuinely convinced that true independence would better serve their children's future than continued subservience to the Imperium. On Castellan 4, we systematically fought our way through residential districts, each building transformed into a desperate fortress by citizens who had chosen death over surrender. They utilized their own furniture as makeshift barricades, kitchen knives as weapons, and even their children as human shields, knowing full well we would not hesitate to fire through civilian casualties to achieve our tactical objectives. They were correct. We did not hesitate. We could not hesitate. The rigorous conditioning that had systematically stripped away our capacity for empathy had also eradicated our ability to discern the moral complexities inherent in situations where good people found themselves tragically aligned against imperial policy. I personally killed a woman on Castellan 4 who was attempting to evacuate her infant son from a building we were tasked with securing for strategic reasons. She was unarmed, posed no discernible threat to our mission, and was unequivocally trying to preserve innocent life rather than offer resistance. But she stood in our path, and the elimination of obstacles was, by design, fundamental to our function. I placed a single bolt round through her center mass and continued my advance without breaking stride. The infant perished moments later in the subsequent explosion, when Brother Garavis utilized frag grenades to clear the remainder of the structure. I felt nothing. No flicker of regret, no pang of guilt, no inkling that I had committed an act worthy of moral consideration. The woman had been a tactical problem demanding a tactical solution. Her death had efficiently served the Emperor's interests by streamlining our mission completion. The infant was an acceptable casualty, subsumed within the greater strategic objective. These were simply facts, devoid of tragedy. Yet that very night, during the mandatory meditation period following every combat operation, I found myself inexplicably attempting to recall the woman's face. Not for any emotional reason, but because I realized I could not form a clear image of her, despite having killed her mere hours earlier. She had been human, female, approximately 30 standard years of age. But beyond these basic tactical descriptors, she had failed to register as worthy of memory. She was an obstacle, nothing more. This absence troubled me, not because I felt guilt over her death, but because it suggested my conditioning might be inadvertently interfering with my ability to process tactical intelligence. If I could not remember the faces of those I had killed, how could I be certain I wasn't overlooking crucial details potentially relevant to future operations? If civilians had become so utterly abstract in my perception that I could not differentiate one from another, how could I accurately assess population compliance levels or effectively identify potential resistance leaders? I brought these concerns before Chaplain Mauricus during my subsequent confession session. He listened to my report with the mechanical, dispassionate attention that all chaplains dedicated to matters of spiritual maintenance. He then informed me that my observations were, in fact, evidence of exceptionally successful conditioning, rather than any cause for alarm. The ability to eliminate obstacles without the impediment of emotional interference was precisely what the chapter demanded from its battle brothers. The very fact that I could no longer perceive individual civilians as significant merely indicated that I had successfully transcended the limitations of human empathy that might otherwise compromise my effectiveness. He was right, of course. Over the ensuing decades, my inability to form meaningful memories of the individuals I killed would prove strategically invaluable in countless engagements. I could storm through civilian areas without the hesitation that might grant enemies opportunities to exploit my positioning. I could make brutal triage decisions regarding casualty evacuation without being distracted by personal attachment to wounded comrades. I could sacrifice squad mates when absolutely necessary without experiencing the debilitating grief that might otherwise cloud my tactical judgment. But it also meant that I would never again experience the profound satisfaction of protecting something I genuinely cared about. Victory became a mere technical achievement, devoid of emotional reward. Survival was simply the continuation of function rather than something to be celebrated. Success meant nothing more than the precise completion of assigned objectives according to acceptable parameters. This is the ultimate price of becoming an angel. You gain the overwhelming power to protect humanity, yet you simultaneously lose the capacity to understand why humanity is even worth protecting. You become capable of incredible, awe-inspiring acts of heroism, but you can no longer comprehend what makes heroism meaningful in the first place. You serve the greatest cause in human history, but you cannot recall why that cause truly matters to the very people whose lives depend on your unwavering service. The centuries passed. Campaigns blurred into one another until I could no longer distinguish a specific battlefield without meticulously consulting my personal mission logs. I earned veteran status after my first century of service, then was promoted to sergeant after my second. The Blood Ravens chapter recognized my unparalleled tactical competence and granted me command responsibilities, allowing me to directly shape the combat effectiveness of entire squads. I meticulously trained new battle brothers in the ruthless methods that had served me so well, impartially passing on the lessons I had learned about the absolute necessity of emotional detachment and unquestioning obedience to orders. By all objective measures, I was an undeniable success. My kill count significantly exceeded chapter averages. My squads consistently achieved mission objectives with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency. My tactical innovations were formally incorporated into standard operating procedures and disseminated to other companies. I had become precisely what the recruitment posters had promised: a living weapon forged in service of humanity's protection. Yet, this very success brought with it its own disquieting revelations. As I gained invaluable experience and climbed in seniority within the chapter, I began to observe troubling patterns in our deployment assignments. Patterns that suggested certain uncomfortable truths about the true nature of our service. We were not, it became clear, primarily deployed to defend humanity against external threats, as the pervasive imperial propaganda ceaselessly suggested. Rather, we were deployed to brutally enforce compliance with imperial authority. irrespective of whether that authority actually served the genuine interests of the populations we purportedly protected. On Voss Prime, for example, we ruthlessly suppressed a worker uprising that had been ignited by the planetary governor's unilateral decision to drastically increase factory output quotas while simultaneously reducing nutritional allowances. These workers had not been corrupted by the insidious taint of chaos, nor had they been influenced by Xenos manipulation. They had simply, desperately, reached the conclusion that their current living conditions were utterly unsustainable, and that organized resistance might, just might, improve their dire circumstances. They were wrong, of course. Our swift and brutal intervention ensured that their living conditions became significantly worse, but their compliance with imperial taxation requirements improved dramatically, almost immediately. On Morian, we participated in the pacification of a religious movement that had dared to develop interpretations of the imperial creed differing from orthodox ecclesiarchy doctrine. Their heresies were, by all accounts, minor, involving obscure questions about the precise nature of the emperor's divinity that had been debated by theological scholars for millennia. But their burgeoning influence threatened the established authority of local church officials, and such authority could never be allowed to appear uncertain, never mind challenged. We killed approximately 40,000 civilians during the 3-week campaign that followed, including the entire population of 6 settlements that had embraced these so-called heretical teachings. On Necroandanda, we provided crucial support to arbitrators' operations against brutal gangs that had been interfering with the vital collection of imperial tithes from the Hive City's industrial sectors. The gangs were indeed brutal organizations, preying mercilessly on civilian populations for their own selfish profit. But crucially, they were also the only effective check on the unchecked power of corporate overlords whose exploitation of workers exceeded even the Imperium's own notoriously lax standards for acceptable resource extraction. Our eradication of gang resistance certainly resulted in measurably improved tithe collection. But, chillingly, it also directly led to working conditions that killed more civilians in the following year than gang violence had claimed in the previous decade combined. Each of these campaigns was, by all operational metrics, a tactical success. Each achieved its stated objectives with minimal expenditure of chapter resources. Each one undeniably strengthened imperial control over populations that might otherwise have cultivated independence movements or resistance organizations. Each one served the emperor's interests by ensuring continued, unquestioning compliance with centralized authority. But these campaigns also serve to illustrate the fundamental, harrowing contradiction at the very heart of a Space Marine's existence. We were created with the express purpose of protecting humanity, yet we spent the vast majority of our time killing humans who had simply reached conclusions about their own best interests that differed from those of imperial administrators. We were marketed as humanity's valiant guardians, but in practice, we functioned as humanity's unforgiving wardens. We preserved the Imperium not primarily by defending it against external threats, but by ensuring that internal dissent could never truly develop into effective, organized resistance. This unsettling realization should have troubled me, but it did not. The conditioning that had forged me into an effective warrior had also rendered me utterly incapable of truly questioning the fundamental assumptions underpinning my service. I could meticulously observe patterns and draw cold, logical, tactical conclusions, but I could not evaluate those conclusions according to any moral criteria that might suggest alternatives to my current function. I served because I had been programmed to serve, not because I had rationally chosen to believe that such service was inherently valuable. But observation, even when utterly devoid of emotional response, still provided information. And over time, that accumulating information gradually coalesced into a clearer, more terrifying understanding of what I had truly become. I was not a guardian angel protecting innocent civilians from monstrous threats. I was an enforcement mechanism, ensuring unwavering compliance with political structures that relentlessly prioritize stability over justice, cold efficiency over compassion, and absolute authority over individual welfare. I was not a hero serving a cause greater than myself. I was a mere tool, wielded by distant administrators who had never experienced the brutal reality of combat, but who keenly understood that violence could often solve problems that negotiation and compromise could never address effectively. I was not protecting humanity. I was, in the grim reality, controlling it. The 4th century of my service brought with it an assignment to the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, tasked specifically with eliminating alien threats to Imperial space. This, I reasoned, should have been a welcome return to the simple clarity of the Metallica 7 campaign. Clear enemies, obvious objectives, straightforward tactical solutions. Aliens were not human. They could not claim Imperial citizenship or appeal to human sympathy. They could be killed without a shred of moral ambiguity because their very existence, by Imperial doctrine, inherently threatened human survival. But even the Death Watch could not provide the absolute clarity I had so desperately hoped for. My first assignment involved the ruthless elimination of a Tau diplomatic mission that had been attempting to establish trade relationships with Imperial worlds along the Damocles Gulf. The Tau were offering genuinely advanced medical technology in exchange for raw materials that their expanding empire desperately required for continued industrial growth. Several planetary governors had, in fact, expressed considerable interest in the proposed arrangements, perceiving genuine opportunities to significantly improve living conditions for their own populations while still maintaining acceptable tithe levels for the administratum. The Ordo Xenos, however, had determined that these negotiations represented an unacceptable security risk. Not because the Tau were actively planning military action against Imperial worlds, but because their diplomatic success might inadvertently encourage other Xeno species to attempt similar approaches. The Imperium's official, uncompromising policy toward alien life was extinction rather than coexistence, and any deviation from that brutal policy would inevitably be interpreted as weakness by enemies throughout the galaxy. We eliminated the Tau delegation during a formal dinner hosted by the unsuspecting governor of Pavonis. 43 aliens died in the initial assault, along with 17 human negotiators and 26 civilian staff members who had been present when we breached the dining facility. The governor himself survived solely because his security detail had been pre-briefed on our operational timeline. He was, however, later executed for treason by an Ordo Hereticus tribunal that summarily found his participation in the negotiations to be undeniable evidence of corruption by alien influence. The tactical execution was flawless. No Tau survived to report the incident to their superiors, and the precise elimination of human witnesses ensured that word of our intervention would not spread to other worlds where similar negotiations might be taking place. The diplomatic mission vanished without a trace, allowing the Imperium to maintain plausible deniability while effectively discouraging future alien attempts at peaceful contact. But the intelligence reports we painstakingly recovered from the Tau delegation revealed information that profoundly complicated the simple narrative of alien threat that had always justified our actions. The Tau had indeed been attempting to establish legitimate trade relationships with imperial worlds, but their motivations were not the expansionist conquest that Ordo Xenos briefings had so readily suggested. Their empire was, in fact, struggling immensely to support vast refugee populations displaced by relentless tyrannid swarm incursions, and they desperately needed additional resources to maintain civilian survival rates at acceptable levels. Their offers of medical technology were genuine attempts to provide valuable goods in exchange for raw materials that the imperial worlds could easily spare without compromising their own strategic capabilities. The Tau had been attempting to save lives. Not human lives, perhaps, but lives nonetheless. They had been offering concrete solutions to systemic problems that killed thousands of imperial citizens every single year. They had been actively trying to forge relationships that might reduce conflict rather than escalate it. And we had killed them for it. This should not have mattered to me. The Tau civilians were still aliens, regardless of their circumstances or motivations. Their survival was not my responsibility, and their destruction served imperial interests by eliminating a potential long-term threat to human expansion. The fact that they had been motivated by desperation rather than overt aggression was tactically irrelevant to the strategic necessity of maintaining imperial isolation from alien influence. But for the first time in 3 centuries, I found myself questioning whether the mere completion of mission objectives necessarily constituted a successful outcome. Not from any emotional attachment to the dead Tau, but from a purely tactical perspective that rigorously considered longer-term consequences rather than simply immediate results. The elimination of the diplomatic mission had, indeed, prevented the establishment of trade relationships that might have encouraged other aliens to attempt similar approaches. But it had also irrevocably eliminated opportunities for vital intelligence gathering that might have provided invaluable information about Tau capabilities, intentions, and weaknesses. It had undeniably strengthened imperial isolation, but it had also eliminated potential allies against tyrannid incursions that relentlessly threatened both human and Tau populations alike. It had preserved ideological purity, but it had sacrificed strategic flexibility that might prove absolutely crucial in future conflicts. These observations troubled me, not because I felt regret about the deaths we had caused, but because they strongly suggested that the decision-making processes governing our deployments might be prioritizing abstract principles over concrete, measurable results. If the Imperium's survival was truly our primary objective, then shouldn't we be willing to compromise on ideological positions when such compromises offered distinct strategic advantages? If protecting humanity was our ultimate, unwavering goal, then shouldn't we be willing to work even with aliens when such cooperation demonstrably served human interests? But the conditioning that had forged me into an effective warrior had also rendered me utterly incapable of pursuing such profound questions to their logical conclusions. I could meticulously observe inconsistencies in imperial policy, but I could not evaluate whether those inconsistencies were genuine problems that demanded solutions or merely necessary sacrifices in service of objectives that I was simply not qualified to understand. I could identify tactical alternatives that might achieve better outcomes, but I could not determine whether those better tactical outcomes were necessarily preferable to outcomes that better served political or theological considerations that superseded purely military concerns. I served because I had been programmed to serve. The cold fact that I no longer understood why my service was valuable did not alter my obligation to continue serving. The fact that I could no longer remember what I was fighting to protect did not eliminate my sacred duty to continue fighting. The fact that I had become something that could question its own purpose while simultaneously remaining utterly incapable of changing its behavior was simply yet another chilling aspect of what I had become. The final, most profound revelation came during my 5th century of service, on a world whose very name I was ordered to forget immediately upon the completion of our mission. A world that officially did not exist in any imperial records, though it had once been home to 17 billion human souls. We were deployed there not to fight aliens or heretics, but to systematically eliminate all evidence of a catastrophically failed experiment in imperial genetic engineering. The world's entire population had been meticulously selected for a project that was intended to create humans capable of surviving in environments too hostile for normal colonization. This included enhanced lung capacity for thin atmospheres, modified skin pigmentation for high radiation environments, and improved bone density for heavy gravity worlds. The Adeptus Mechanicus had confidently promised the Administratum that such radical modifications would allow for unprecedented imperial expansion into previously uninhabitable systems, thus opening vast new frontiers for human colonization without the massive infrastructure investments that terraforming typically required. The project had succeeded beyond all expectations. The modified humans were indeed fully capable of thriving in hostile environments, but they had also unexpectedly developed capabilities that their creators had not anticipated. Profoundly enhanced cognitive function, vastly improved disease resistance, and extended lifespans that exceeded normal human ranges by centuries rather than mere decades. They had become something new, something more, something that might eventually supersede baseline humanity entirely. This, it was decreed, could not be allowed. The Imperium was fundamentally built on the core assumption that human nature was static, that the species had achieved its perfect, unalterable form during the dark age of technology, and that any deviation from that form represented corruption rather than evolution. The modified humans presented an existential challenge to every principle that justified imperial authority over human affairs. If humanity itself could be improved through scientific manipulation, then perhaps other aspects of imperial doctrine were equally open to revision. The draconian solution was total population elimination, followed by orbital bombardment that would reduce the world's surface to molten glass. No evidence of the experiment would be allowed to survive. No modified humans would escape to spread their genetic alterations to other worlds, and no records would exist to suggest that the project had ever even been attempted. The world would become another cautionary tale about the perils of unsanctioned scientific research, a grim reminder of why the Adeptus Mechanicus required such careful, stringent oversight from orthodox imperial authorities. We were chosen for this mission not primarily because of our combat capabilities, but precisely because of our specialized psychological conditioning. Normal Imperial Guard regiments might experience moral qualms about exterminating human populations that pose no military threat. Planetary defense forces might openly question orders that required them to kill their own species for the mere crime of successful evolution. But Space Marines could be absolutely relied upon to follow orders, regardless of any personal feelings about those orders, because we no longer possessed personal feelings that might interfere with our operational effectiveness. The campaign lasted 6 grueling months, not because the modified humans offered significant military resistance, but because 17 billion individuals required an immense amount of time to locate and eliminate, even with orbital support. They had meticulously built cities that extended deep underground, having anticipated that their world's hostile surface conditions might necessitate extensive subterranean development. They had also developed advanced technologies that allowed them to remain hidden from our scanning equipment for extended periods. Most significantly, they had forged social structures that profoundly prioritize collective survival over individual preservation, meaning that parents would readily sacrifice themselves to protect their children, and entire communities would coordinate their defensive efforts rather than fragmenting into competing factions. They fought us with a desperation that I had rarely, if ever, encountered in previous campaigns. Not the mindless, frothing fury of chaos cultists, nor the mechanical determination of Tau warriors, but the calculated ferocity of people who understood exactly what our victory would mean for them and their children. They knew that we had not come to conquer their world or to merely demand their compliance with imperial authority. They knew, with chilling certainty, that we had come to eliminate them entirely, to erase their very existence so completely that no trace of their achievements would survive to inspire others. They fought like true humans, defending their families, their homes, their very future. They fought with the kind of passionate commitment that I had observed in the corrupted workers on Metallica 7, but directed toward preservation rather than wanton destruction. They fought for something they loved more than life itself, something that made death preferable to surrender. And we killed them all. Every man, woman, and child, every family line, every unique cultural tradition, every technological innovation that might have genuinely improved the human condition. We eradicated a civilization that had achieved in just 3 generations what the Imperium had been struggling to accomplish for 10 millennia. Not because they threatened humanity, but because they represented what humanity might become. I was present for the final, gruesome phase of the operation, the elimination of the last underground shelter complex, where approximately 12,000 civilians had taken refuge, men and women who had never once taken up arms against the Imperium. Children who had been born after our arrival and would die before their first birthdays. Elderly individuals whose only crime was surviving long enough to witness the apotheosis of their species. They were not hiding when we breached their final defenses. They were not begging for mercy or attempting to negotiate terms for their survival. They were singing. 12,000 voices, raised in harmonies that resonated hauntingly through the vast tunnel systems they had called home. Melodies that spoke of love and loss and enduring hope, despite the absolute certainty of extinction. They were singing because they wanted their last collective act as a species to be beautiful rather than desperate, creative rather than destructive, profoundly human rather than merely functional. I killed them while they sang. We all did. Our bolters sang their own grim hymns as mass-reactive shells found their targets. Each shot was precisely calculated to ensure maximum casualties while minimizing ammunition expenditure. The music slowly stopped in sections as voices were silenced forever, until only echoes remained to mark the passage of the last genetically enhanced humans in the galaxy. When the killing was finally finished and the orbital bombardment began, I stood on the command deck of our strike cruiser and watched the world die. Cyclonic torpedoes cracked its crust, while virus bombs sterilized any remaining organic material that might have survived our ground operations. Within 6 hours, the world, once teeming with 17 billion genetically enhanced humans, had been reduced to a desolate orb of cooling magma, condemned to orbit a star that would soon be struck from all Imperial navigation charts. The mission was unequivocally a resounding success. Not a single trace remained to suggest that the forbidden genetic enhancement project had ever been conceived, let alone attempted. No modified humans escaped to propagate their unauthorized alterations across the galaxy. No records survived that might hint at humanity's potential for evolution beyond its rigidly defined limitations. The Imperium remained steadfast in its core assumptions about the immutable, static nature of human biology and the absolute necessity of suppressing all unauthorized scientific research. Yet as I gazed upon that burning world, a memory resurfaced, unbidden and profoundly disquieting, a memory I had not entertained in centuries. It was the taste of my mother's bread. Sweet honey and rich grain harvested from the sun-drenched southern fields of Vidia Prime, baked in the pre-dawn hours before the work bells tolled across our settlement. The memory arrived without warning, without context, without any logical explanation. I had deliberately purged all thoughts of my mother, my childhood, or anything related to my prior existence since my first century of service. The rigorous conditioning that forged me into an effective warrior had meticulously eradicated such attachments, deeming them unnecessary impediments to my function. Yet somehow, in witnessing the wholesale destruction of 17 billion souls who had died singing, I recalled what it truly felt like to be human. I remembered the sensation of tasting something crafted with love, not merely engineered for nutritional necessity. I remembered the anticipation of pleasure, a stark contrast to the grim endurance that defined my existence. I remembered what it felt like to be part of something that existed for reasons far transcending mere tactical efficiency or strategic advantage. And then I comprehended the magnitude of what I had lost. It wasn't merely my humanity, which I had been meticulously taught to view as a necessary sacrifice in service of a paramount cause. It wasn't simply my capacity for emotional response, which I had been conditioned to perceive as a critical weakness, compromising my efficacy as a warrior. I had lost the very faculty to understand what made life inherently worth living, what rendered survival a struggle worth undertaking, what made existence unequivocally preferable to extinction. The enhanced humans had perished singing because, despite their genetic modifications, they still clung to the essence of what it meant to be human. They had preserved something that I had been systematically stripped of during my transformation into a perfect instrument of imperial will. They had retained this capacity for love, for hope, for beauty, for all the profound things that impart meaning to existence beyond mere biological function. I had become a being capable of eliminating beauty without even grasping what beauty truly was. I had become a being capable of destroying love without ever comprehending its meaning. I had become a being capable of extinguishing hope while remaining utterly ignorant of the solace hope offered to those who possessed it. I had become the perfect servant of an empire that paradoxically preserved humanity by systematically annihilating everything that made humanity worth preserving. But this profound realization altered nothing. I could objectively observe the loss without feeling a flicker of regret. I could intellectually grasp the sacrifice without ever questioning its necessity. I could acknowledge the price paid without ever deeming it excessive. The conditioning that had engineered these capabilities had also flawlessly ensured my continued service, utterly irrespective of my personal assessment of that service's intrinsic value. I was fundamentally incapable of rebellion, incapable of doubt, incapable of choosing a divergent path, even if my intellect could vaguely conceive of such an alternative. I was precisely what the Imperium demanded me to be. Nothing more, nothing less. The centuries since that nameless world have blurred into an interminable cycle of deployment and ultimate victory, of relentless conflict and cold resolution, a service devoid of intrinsic purpose, genuine satisfaction, or any hope beyond its own grim perpetuation. I have felled millions of the Imperium's enemies, safeguarded billions of Imperial citizens, and maintained the fragile stability of countless worlds against both internal and external threats. I have served the Emperor with unyielding fidelity for over 400 years, and I shall continue this service until catastrophic battle damage or the inevitable erosion of time finally claims my enhanced physiology. I am lauded as a hero of the Imperium, a living legend, a guardian angel protecting humanity from the existential darkness beyond the stars. Children across Imperial space dream of embodying my form, imagining themselves wielding the same formidable weapons I carry and encased in the armor that has deflected countless assaults. They behold me as the living embodiment of everything noble and pure within human civilization, a figure worthy of worship and emulation. They do not know that I can no longer remember why their dreams matter. They do not know that I have forgotten what it feels like to care about anything beyond the precise completion of assigned objectives. They do not know that I have become something that can protect them without truly understanding what makes them worth protecting. Something that can serve their interests without comprehending the profound essence of what those interests entail. They do not know that in the very act of becoming their guardian, I have irrevocably ceased to be one of them. And perhaps that is the most insidious victory chaos could ever achieve against the Imperium. Not the blatant corruption of its servants, but the creation of servants so utterly pure in their dedication that they can no longer comprehend the inherent value of what they meticulously serve. Not the outright destruction of humanity, but the chilling transformation of humanity's designated protectors into something that preserves human life without preserving human meaning. We are the Adeptus Astartes. We are the Emperor's finest warriors. We are the unyielding shield that stands between mankind and the ravenous darkness that perpetually seeks to devour it. We are no longer human, and we have forgotten why humanity truly matters. But we will continue serving. We will continue fighting. We will continue killing in the Emperor's sacred name until nothing remains of us but the echoing roar of bolter fire and the fading memory of wars whose original purpose we can no longer recall. We are angels without a heaven, guardians without understanding, protectors without love. We are precisely what we were designed to be,